Maryland has a supermajority of Democrats in the state house. In both the House and the Senate in Annapolis, Maryland Democrats have a supermajority. And Maryland, a supermajority is 3/5. What does that mean? That means that if Democrats have more than 3/5 of both houses, they can override any veto that the governor has. So right now, Democrats have a much larger margin than 3/5. And that means that the reparations bill or the data center study or the bill to make polluters pay, when it goes to the governor's desk, the governor can veto it, but the General Assembly, as soon as they can convene, can override that veto. That is the crux of their power in the state, is the ability to have the General Assembly override any decision that the governor makes.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Andy, I mean, folks are listening and are like, oh, they have more than 3/5. Maybe that's because, more than 3/5 of people in Maryland are Democrats, or they won those elections fair and square. It's like, no, they have gerrymandered districts in order to secure that super majority, right? When Lawrence was talking about redistricting, a lot of the attention when it comes to conversations about redistricting is on the federal level, but it's also an opportunity to redistrict and gerrymander on the state legislative level too. So I think it's important to point out that there are lots of independents. There's a pretty good number of Republicans. There are some third-party registered folks, and if we had more small d Democratic districts, then that 3/5 supermajority might not look the same way it does today.
And that's a really good point. And I think that they engineer the districts in order to do two things. One, to make sure that the Democratic Party has control of the General Assembly. And the Democratic Party has had control of the General Assembly since 1866, when they banded together to abolish the 2 years of Reconstruction that Maryland had. And it's like 8 years in that time where Democrats did not have a majority in the Maryland General Assembly. And since like the 1940s, they've had a supermajority, which means that they can override Democrats in the Maryland General Assembly can override any veto that a governor makes. Now, the second thing they do is make sure that there is no competition. And so you will see a lot of races in Maryland where the primary is uncontested. The people who are incumbents do not have opponents from within their own party. And also a lot of elections in Maryland where the general election is uncontested. So I'll always tell this story about a person that I met who was wondering why his state senator was never responding to him. And he lives in Prince George's County, and his senator is a Democrat in a 90% Democrat district. So I said, well, who's your person? I went and looked him up. Well, that person was not elected to his seat in the House of Delegates. He was appointed to his seat in the House of Delegates by his party central committee when there was a vacancy. And then when he had to face election in the next cycle, he had no opponents in the primary, and he had no opponents in the general. And then later on, he was appointed to go from the House of Delegates to the state Senate. And then when he ran for his Senate seat, he had no opponents in the primary and no opponents in the general. There's a really good reason that a person like this is not responsive to voters, because voters didn't put them in the office. Party bosses put them in the office, and special interests put them in the office. So Maryland Democrats have used the ability to draw district maps, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, to ensure that they maintain the power of having a supermajority in both houses of the General Assembly, and that they have not competitive districts. So we get this thing where then that funnels into what we talked about earlier, a 90-day legislative session. A 90-day legislative session was originally put together because supposedly we are an agricultural state, and those fancy people who were getting elected senator had some planting to do or something. Now, if I know anything about Maryland, most of those folks who were in Annapolis making decisions in the 1860s were not, in fact, going back to their farm and toiling and plowing the soil with their hand. They probably had enslaved people doing that in a lot of cases, and underpaid labor doing that in every other case. But nonetheless, we have a 90-day General Assembly session, which means that all of the business of state government has to happen in the first 90 days of the year. So usually by the time baseball season starts, government season is over. So if you think about the amount of time from basically the NFL playoffs to the beginning of baseball season, that's when all government business gets done in Maryland. And that is a really good way to make sure that the public doesn't know what's going on. And the people who are in positions of power can wield and use their power to make deals that the public never knows about. So what that ends up with is a state where the people who run the state are not responsive to the people who are in the state. They're responsive to national narratives. They're responsible to big donors, and they're responsible to party leadership. It also leads to a place where the party bosses in Annapolis have a tremendous amount of power, and they wield it in order to maintain discipline amongst all the other Democrats. So there's a lot of times where plenty of Democrats will have very progressive ideas that are backed by the majority of their voters, but they are unable to present them to the people or unable to get them passed because the people in Annapolis who have the power don't want that type of thing to happen. All right, so that was my sort of brief introduction to Maryland state government civics. How did I do?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is you mentioned the appointment process. What is it? Over a quarter of members of the Maryland General Assembly are initially appointed and not elected. So we need special elections, and in order to make sure that 100%, there's really no reason, especially with multi-member districts in most of the state, for there to be an appointment process instead of special elections. So we want to fix that.
Yeah. And that may not be on the list that we're about to look at, but it's a good reminder that the list that we're about to look at is evolving and it moves over time and things like that. So there you go. You can go to gogreen2026.com democracy. You can see what our grassroots democracy platform looks like. I want to go through a couple of the things real quick. But you can always check it out on the website. And if you click on these things on the website, it unfurls and has more information and things like that. But the first thing is voter-driven constitutional amendments. Maryland is one of, I think, 16 states where voters don't have the ability to sign a petition in order to put something on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. In many states, you hear these ballot initiatives and things like that, where voters can pool together and they can run a petition campaign and they can put an idea to amend the Constitution in front of voters. Now, look, this process has all sorts of flaws to it, and it's not perfect, and there's a lot of issues about it. But it is better than a process where one party has the sole monopoly on changing the Constitution. So one of the first things that we would do if we were elected is tell the General Assembly that they need to pass a constitutional amendment that allows the voters to decide whether or not we have these voter-driven constitutional amendments that most states have. It's not going to solve all the problems in the world, but it gets us a little bit closer to having voters be able to override Democrats who are elected in Annapolis and be able to have their own say instead of only having to decide what the people in power say.
Yeah, and I'll just give a concrete example that's happening right now of a good friend who is a longtime organizer in Maryland, Andrew Reinell, and he was a speaker at our campaign launch party back in September, and he's now in Michigan where he grew up, and he's working with a statewide coalition for a constitutional amendment for a millionaire tax to fund education, right? We, under the current system in Maryland, cannot do that, right? In order to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot, like you said, Andy, we have to go through the legislature instead of doing the grassroots organizing work that they're doing in Michigan to tax millionaires and fund education.
Yep, and so that's priority number one. If we get elected, that is going to be the first bill that we ask the General Assembly to put in, is a bill that allows voters to have a choice on that. So let me just be very clear on it. A constitutional amendment has to be approved by the voters. So even if we were to put this bill in, we would put this bill in, and if it passed and got on the ballot, the voters would get to determine whether it became the law of the land or not. So that's number one. Number two is expand and protect voting rights. This is where a lot of Democrats' efforts in relation to grassroots democracy occurs, and it is important. The Trump administration is launching a full-scale assault on voting rights, and that's not going to, Maryland needs to strengthen itself against that, needs to make sure that the voting rights that we have right now are protected, that they don't get eroded for the people who Trump would most like to erode them for. And that is working people, young people, queer people, Black people, and people who are immigrants or may not have English as a first language, or people who are returning from incarceration. These are all groups that the Trump administration would like to remove voting rights from and is actively working to do so. And we need to expand and protect those. We also need to expand voting rights to include people who are currently incarcerated, to include people who are in the United States or in Maryland legally but are not citizens, and to include young people 16 and up. There are some initiatives around the state to do this in some localities, but we believe this should happen across Maryland, and that we should expand and protect the ability to vote, because fundamentally, if we're talking about grassroots democracy, that's an essential element of it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also important to challenge this traditional liberal narrative of this naturally and gradually expanding franchise of over the centuries in the U.S. The franchise has kind of expanded on its own with a little bit of protest, and it's been a linear direction, more and more people getting the right to vote. But we see, through mass incarceration, through some of the things that were put into place in the 1867 Constitution in Maryland, that it actually is not a linear process, that there are constant efforts, not just by the Trump administration, but also by Democrats historically, to restrict the franchise. Actually, for the first few decades of Maryland's history after independence from England, immigrants could vote even without citizenship in state and local elections, right? So there was a restriction when the Know Nothing Party and very anti-immigrant racist forces conspired to remove that right from immigrants. And I think that's happened over and over again. And, Lawrence was talking earlier about critical race theory and interest alignment. Well, the voting age dropping from 21 to 18 is a great example of that. Folks were, young people, teenagers were going off to die in Vietnam, and they weren't able to vote. So there's always multiple factors at play, and I think it's important we challenge this narrative of, well, voting rights were expanding and expanding until Trump got elected, and then he, did lots of bad things.
Yep, no, I think that's a good point. And so as we think about expanding and protecting voting rights, we're not talking about it in terms of just one administration. We're talking about it as a span of history in which this is an important, necessary way to make sure that more people can participate in the democracy. So the next one on the list is statewide public campaign financing. Right now, there is public financing available for the governor's race, and then each county can decide whether they want to have public financing for their county executive and their county council races. Public financing is a way in which people agree to participate in a limited small dollar donation program with strict donation and transparency requirements, and in turn, they qualify for matching funds that allow them to take those dollars and multiply them by 2, 4, 6, 8 times. This has been used in counties across the state for a couple of cycles now, most notably perhaps in Baltimore City last time. It was used by an insurgent challenger, Zach Blanchard, in the Democratic primary, who was able to defeat one of the most entrenched incumbents, and he was able to do so because he had access to the public financing dollars. Public financing has been shown to be a strong antidote to money in politics, and it is a thing that we can do right now in order to change the terms of the playing field. We're never going to be level with somebody who has $1 billion, but we do have the ability to get more public dollars that come from fines and fees and things like that, where people are doing bad campaign finance, breaking the law, and use it in order to fund candidates. We would expand this to statewide, so it would not only be the governor's race at the constitutional level, it would be the comptroller, the attorney general. All of those things would have statewide public financing. We'd also We'd also push for a law that allowed it to be used for school board races and for all of the counties in the state to be able to have it. In addition to that, we would also make sure that state house and state senate would have it. There's some moves in Annapolis to do some parts of that, but for the most part, state delegates and state senators don't want to allow their opponents to have public financing. And so I think we really have to push on this being a all-inclusive thing, not just a few races here and there.
Yeah. And a lot of the counties that have implemented it are in the I-95 corridor or the DMV and Baltimore areas. I'm excited to see this expand if the folks there want it, which a lot of them are organizing for it. In Frederick County, going out to Allegheny County next week, a lot of those counties don't have county executives and county councils. They have county commissioners, and often those county commissioners are county-wide offices, right? Instead of smaller district-based city council or county council like we might have in some of the more populous counties. And I think especially if those offices are county-wide, having public campaign financing to run that more expensive county-wide race would be really impactful and allow for new voices and traditionally, historically, and currently marginalized voices to play a bigger role in the electoral politics and the policymaking of those counties.
Yeah, one criticism of the current program is that Democrats in Annapolis have agreed that Democrats in the counties can give Democrats running for office money to run for office. And that is a good criticism. That is not a reason to abandon the system. That is a reason to expand who's using it and who has access to it. So the next thing on here is ranked choice voting and proportional representation. There's probably not a thing I talk to people more about than ranked choice voting and proportional, or ranked choice voting is the thing people want to talk to me about. Proportional representation is the thing I want to talk to people about. So ranked choice voting is a method of voting that allows voters to rank their choices in order and to allow that to count, to have a more complex and nuanced approach to elections. It has existed in the New York City primary, and Mamdani was able to use it effectively. It has existed in it has existed in Tacoma Park for a long time in Maryland. It recently was passed in Greenbelt in Maryland, and there's a lot of small towns, municipalities, and states that are moving toward a model that allows some ranking of the vote. The benefit of ranked choice voting is that it is usually better for voters who have less toxic politics, and it allows for more coalitional politics in the early rounds of elections. It's a pretty good system. It helps voters. It helps turnouts. And, I think it is a better way of counting the votes than the current winner-take-all system that we have. It distributes a little bit of power as well. And I think it's a valuable system that we should push statewide in Maryland and allow each of the counties to use as they want. We also should be pushing for proportional representation. While ranked choice voting changes the way that we count the votes, proportional representation changes the way that we allocate the seats. So in Maryland, where we have multi-member state house districts, and there are 3 people from each district who are elected, we currently do it in a way where you get to vote for all 3 of them, and then the sort of plurality of votes wins. That's a bad way to do multi-member districts. But if you had it where people voted for one of the people, one of the choices, and the top 3 vote getters proportionally were the ones who got allocated the seats, you start to get to a system that recognizes that we have a diverse set of people and a diverse set of political views that can't be captured by one party and one slate. So ranked choice voting and proportional representation are a solid electoral reform that would align us with most of the world, frankly, and bring voters more fair, more representative politics. And it's absolutely a thing that should be at the center of our work.
Yeah, I think some of these reforms would also undermine the power of slates. So a lot of these multi-member districts, they have, 3 people, and if one person retires or gets promoted or goes to jail or passes away and there's a vacancy, they kind of often, the 2 other delegates, pick who they want for the third and get them appointed and then get them elected on a slate. And so I think ranked choice voting, proportional representation, campaign financing, all of these things would undermine some of those forces which insulate the status quo from challenge.
Totally. And ballot petition modernization is another one of these things. So, right now, ballot petitions are used in Maryland by a couple of groups of people outside of the two-party system. New parties, like the Green Party, have to file ballot petitions and get 10,000 valid signatures in order to show up on the ballot every 2 years, unless they get 1% in the governor's race and the presidential race. Independent candidates have to use these ballot petitions. Charter amendments have to use these ballot petitions. Constitutional referendums have to use these ballot petitions. And is that it? I think those are it. There might be one other thing in there. But the problem with the problem is that these tools are paper forms where signatures and names have to match exactly. And about 1 in 3 legitimate signatures get thrown out by the local board of elections because the handwriting is bad or the date is wrong or something like that. Well, during the 2020 COVID state of emergency, we were able to use electronic signatures based on regulations that I helped negotiate with the State Board of Elections and based on a court case that we got a settlement with the State Board of Elections. Those electronic petitions were easier to use. They had a 99% validation rate, and we weren't throwing out 1 in 3 voters' legitimate expression of their voting rights because some poor person who had to read all 10,000 of these things couldn't read their chicken scratch. Most of these petitions are circulated at farmers markets. So a lot of times you'll be out at a farmers market, you got a handful of groceries in one hand, like you're carrying your dog, and you got a coffee or something, and you're working on this precarious balance. And some earnest person will come up to you and ask you if you can sign a thing for X, Y, and Z petition. Many people are willing and happy to sign it. But like I said, they got their vegetables, they got their dog, they got their coffee. And so sometimes they'll sign it and they'll forget their middle name, or they'll put something on the wrong line or something like that. That is an expression that is guaranteed to them by the Maryland Constitution, and it gets thrown out based on clerical errors that are very clear and discernible. 1 in 3 is about the number that we say right now. So we suggest a whole series of ballot petition modernizations that make it easier for Marylanders to use the rights they have in the state constitution in order to show that they want something on the ballot that isn't one of the two parties. We can go into a lot more depth on this, but that's the high level of it. Any thoughts on that?
Well, just, so much of our life has moved beyond pen and paper. You can update your voter registration online. You can buy a house basically online. You can do so many things fully online. And yet there's, in certain quarters, disdain for online political activity by institutional players who can hire lobbyists to be physically present and to push pieces of paper, right? And so what this would do would say, well, public life and political life has shifted online, not completely, but to a large degree, and this would just reflect that change in a material way.
And I think one of the funny things about this is, like, what else what you and I could do tonight if we wanted to? We could form a super PAC online entirely without ever having to sign any piece of paper and transfer unlimited amounts of money in order to advertise for one campaign or another. And so you and I could, if we weren't running on a publicly financed ticket, you and I could start a super PAC and transfer the billions of dollars that we have tucked under our mattress. You've got $1 billion tucked under your mattress, right? But transfer the billions of dollars we have into some campaign that was going after a candidate. We could do all of that online without ever having to step foot in Annapolis, without ever having to sign a piece of paper. And so it's telling that we can do that process online, but we can't do the process of using our rights to have somebody that we want to be on a ballot. So what's next? Political debates on Maryland Public Television. We talked about this a little bit with Lawrence tonight.
You got to press the applause button for this one, Andy. Come on.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There we go.
So, political debates on Maryland Public Television is the thing that we're going to be pushing this year. We have a petition available for it. You can go check that out at here. We have a petition. We also have a bill that is going to be coming. We're going to be doing some organizing with members and things like that. But this question goes beyond whether I get to be on the debate stage with Wes Moore and goes to a question of how public television should be oriented toward its audience. We think that public television should be serving all Marylanders. We believe that public television should be a key place for information and news that is not mediated by a corporation and that is coming to you from the state, letting voters know, letting residents know what is happening in the state. So we would like to see political debates for statewide offices on Maryland Public Television that include all of the parties. We would also like to see a broader culture of political debate on Maryland Public Television that brings in more perspectives, that informs people about the bills that are going on in Annapolis beyond what they're doing right now. They're doing some great work on that right now, but we want to expand on that. Look, we believe that this is good for public television, good for Maryland, good for voters, and probably bad for establishment politicians who are afraid to have people knowing what they're doing. And so we're going to push for expanded political debates on Maryland Public Television. It goes beyond the bill that we have for this year. It's a bigger push that puts debate at the center of a vibrant grassroots democracy and puts public television as the vehicle for expanding that.
Yeah. I think the focus on MPT is really important here because part of the function of public television is education, right? One of the board members for Maryland Public Television is the superintendent of Maryland Public Schools, right? This channel is supposed to be educating Marylanders, and not just educating Marylanders about the two options that they are most likely to hear about in all of the other corporate-owned media. But when you go to cast your ballot and you see all of the names for governor or for the other offices, and a platform dedicated to serving the public through education should be motivated to, and perhaps in this case be pushed to, educate viewers about all of their choices so that they can make up their own mind about who they're going to vote for. So I think I'm really excited about this bill. It gives us a way to have this conversation that we've been having outside of institutions of legislative power. We're going to now have this conversation inside the Maryland General Assembly. What pre-filing means, we mentioned pre-filing a couple times. That means that this bill is going to be guaranteed to be assigned to a committee and be read, and have a hearing because it's in the House. So I think, get ready to write your testimony, get ready to testify via Zoom, or, collaborate with us. We'll give you a ride. We'll carpool with you. We'll get you to Annapolis if you want to come testify in person, because this is going to be a big opportunity to say that you support multi-party democracy in Maryland and you support educating all Marylanders to know who their choices are in the general election.
Yeah, totally 100%. And again, this is good for us, good for third parties, but it is also good for voters. It is good for democracy. It is good for Maryland Public Television, and it is good for public television at a time when public television is under attack because it is too aligned with one party or the other. Now is the time to take public television and show that it is there for all of the people and all of the parties, and to let folks hear. Every candidate has a voice. It's time for public television to be the vehicle for people to hear that voice, especially when we know that the corporations are never going to put somebody on the stage who's talking about the way that they're colluding with the data centers and with everybody else. So we need public television to do its job here and to come through. Look, we are at like an hour and 40 minutes, and Owen has been standing this whole time. So I'm going to go quick through municipal reform, democratizing the General Assembly, and making the constitutional vote fair. And then we're going to wrap up so that Owen can sit down, breathe, and then we can get on with the holiday. But municipal reform is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of municipalities in the state of Maryland, and they range from small couple of people, a couple hundred people, to large, almost 100,000 person municipalities. the way that these are governed has not been reformed in a long time in Maryland. It is hard to form a new one, and it is hard to change one that exists right now. So we would look at making it easier for charter reform to happen in municipalities. We would look at easier for people like Silver Spring and Towson to actually exist as places that have their own representation, or Olney, or some of these big communities that are unincorporated. We would make sure that this is a priority. It's never really been a priority in Annapolis, and we think it needs to be. Democratizing the General Assembly, we've talked a little bit about how it's 90 days, it's isolated from everybody, and there's not much access for people. We want to see it be expanded. We want to put this farmer legislator myth to bed where it belongs, and start having these folks do the kind of work that needs to happen year round, so that we're addressing the problems that Marylanders face. We mentioned earlier that there's a huge stress on the energy grid coming up, and there's a big redistricting debate. And we can't talk about those things until January unless we do the very radical thing of calling a special session to talk about them. Among other things, we would expand the General Assembly session so that it is longer. We would pay people more. We'd have more professionalized staff. There's a lot of things we could do to make the General Assembly more responsive to people, and not a place where politicians get to hide the dirt that they're doing from their voters so that only their donors and their special interests see it. So that's going to be a big issue for us. And the last thing, we talked about this a little bit, is we want to make the Constitutional Convention vote fair. Oh, let me see if I can have a succinct explanation of this. The way that there are two ways to change the Constitution in the state of Maryland. One of them is the General Assembly passing a bill and having it go to the voters and get on the ballot. That's one. The second way is that every 20 years, the voters get the opportunity to vote and say whether they want to have a constitutional convention where we get together and, some Alexander Hamilton type of thing. We write our thoughts and ideas, and we share what we want the state to be like. The problem is the way the Constitutional Convention clause of the Constitution is written is that it is not a simple majority. And in 2010, when we had a vote on the Constitutional Convention, 54% of the people who voted on it voted for it. Great. That should have meant we had a Constitutional Convention in 2010. But the way that it is written, the people voting in all of the races in the election count for it. So the no's and the not voting people count as no's. This is rigged in order to make sure that we don't have a constitutional convention. It's very clear that the people in the 1860s who wrote this in there with the intention of making sure that voters couldn't challenge their power by calling a constitutional convention. We can have a whole episode about what was happening in the 1860s that might have motivated people to make those types of decisions in the wake of Maryland's Reconstruction. But the long and short of it is the Constitutional Convention has a vote every 20 years, and it is rigged in order to the House always wins. We want to unrig it so that the people have an opportunity to win, and so the Constitution is not protecting the same people the 1860s Democrats wanted to protect.
Yeah. Allow people to abstain is how I would describe it. Currently, abstentions, if you choose not to vote on this because you don't have a strong opinion or you don't understand it, it counts as a no. That's not what people who have abstained met and for the most part mean by that abstention. They mean I'm not sure, or I don't care, or this isn't that important to me, or I'm in a hurry and I voted for the top of the ticket and I didn't get all the way down to the bottom. But when Andy says it's rigged, it means it's counting those people's intent to abstain as objection, as a no vote against the Constitutional Convention, and that is not what most voters intend when they don't vote on this. So let a simple majority of people carry the day.
Yeah. So look, all of these are ideas about ways that we could use tools available to us right now and tools available to the General Assembly right now to significantly address the democratic responsiveness gap that we have here in Maryland. And we were going to be talking about these things a lot because it's one of the core pillars of the work that we're doing. If you go to the website, you can read more detail on each of these things. We'll be adding more detail over time.